November 14th, 1957. Apalachin, New York. Police roadblocks surround a quiet rural estate. Dozens of powerful mafia figures flee into nearby woods, abandoning luxury cars and carefully rehearsed silence. The headlines would call it the meeting that exposed the American Mafia. But one name stood apart: Stefano Magaddino. For decades, he had ruled one of the most secretive crime organizations in America. Not from New York City or Chicago, but from Buffalo. No flashy wars, no public theatrics, just patience, silence, and control. While other crime families rose and collapsed in violence, Buffalo endured, quietly shaping cross-border smuggling, gambling, labor influence, and organized networks stretching into Canada. And even after Apalachin shook the underworld, the Buffalo crime family didn't disappear. It faded, slowly, deliberately, almost invisibly. This is the story of the Mafia empire that survived by never being seen.
At the turn of the 20th century, Buffalo, New York was more than an industrial city. It was a gateway, a strategic crossing between the United States and Canada, where railroads, shipping lanes, and immigration routes converged. Opportunity flowed through its docks, and so did organized crime. Italian immigrant communities brought traditions, loyalties, and rivalries from Sicily. Among them was Stefano Magaddino, born in Castellamare del Golfo. He arrived in America during a period when crime networks were forming quietly inside neighborhoods, long before the word mafia dominated headlines. Buffalo offered something rare: distance from national attention. While New York and Chicago erupted into public gang conflicts, smaller cities allowed disciplined groups to organize in relative silence. Here, Magadino began building alliances rooted in family ties, mutual protection, and economic opportunity. There were no grand declarations, no sudden rise to power, just steady positioning. By the 1920s, Buffalo had become a strategic outpost in a growing national underworld, and Magadino was already shaping its direction.
January 1920. Prohibition begins. Overnight, alcohol becomes illegal and enormously profitable. Buffalo's geography transformed it into a smuggling corridor. The Niagara River and Lake Erie created a natural pathway between Canadian distilleries and American demand. While authorities struggled to enforce the law, organized networks adapted quickly. Magadino's organization leaned into discipline rather than confrontation. Shipments moved quietly. Partnerships formed across the border. Labor connections, transportation routes, and local businesses became part of a system designed for stability rather than spectacle. Unlike the violent gang wars unfolding in Chicago, Buffalo's operations emphasized consistency. Profits came not from sudden power grabs, but from reliable supply lines and controlled expansion. Prohibition didn't just create money, it created structure. And by the early 1930s, the Buffalo crime family had evolved from a local network into a recognized force within the broader American mafia landscape.
By the 1930s, Stefano Magaddino was no longer just a participant in organized crime. He was a leader shaping its direction in Buffalo and beyond. His approach differed from many bosses of the era. Visibility was avoided. Violence, when possible, was minimized. Loyalty and silence were treated as currency equal to money. Those who worked within the organization understood the expectations: discipline, patience, and discretion. Magaddino also maintained connections beyond Buffalo, communicating with national mafia figures as the American crime structure became more coordinated after Prohibition. These relationships ensured the city remained relevant without attracting unwanted attention. Local businesses, transportation networks, and labor circles quietly strengthened the family's influence. To outsiders, Buffalo appeared stable, even ordinary. But beneath that calm surface, a carefully managed organization was taking root. An empire was forming, not through headlines or chaos, but through consistency and time.
By the late 1930s, Buffalo's importance inside organized crime wasn't loud, it was strategic. Sitting beside Canada, the city functioned as a corridor. Goods, money, and influence crossed the border in ways that were difficult for authorities to fully monitor. What had begun during Prohibition didn't disappear when alcohol became legal again. It evolved. Magadino's network expanded into gambling operations, transportation partnerships, and labor influence tied to shipping and construction. These ventures weren't built overnight. They relied on routine, trust, and steady relationships with local businesses. The goal was sustainability, not spectacle. Nationally, the American Mafia was reorganizing after internal conflicts earlier in the decade. Buffalo positioned itself as dependable, a city that didn't attract unnecessary attention. That reputation made it valuable. While headlines focused on New York's powerful families, Buffalo's organization strengthened quietly, building a cross-border system that would sustain it for decades.
As the 1940s moved into the early 1950s, the structure of organized crime in America became more coordinated. Meetings between influential figures helped maintain order, settle disputes, and protect business interests across regions. Buffalo's role was subtle but respected. Stefano Magaddino maintained relationships with leaders in New York and other cities, ensuring his organization stayed aligned with broader mafia interests. He avoided public conflicts and rarely sought attention. That restraint gave Buffalo stability during a period when other families faced internal struggles and law enforcement pressure. Locally, operations blended into everyday life. Social clubs, small businesses, and community connections provided cover and continuity. The organization's strength wasn't measured in headlines, it was measured in how little attention it attracted. By the early 1950s, Buffalo had become one of the most quietly durable crime families in the country, guided by patience and consistency rather than force.
November 14, 1957. A rural property in Apalachin, New York. Law enforcement officers notice unfamiliar luxury cars arriving in a quiet area. Suspicion grows. Soon, police converge on the estate, interrupting what would later be described as one of the most significant gatherings of organized crime leaders in American history. The discovery sends shockwaves nationwide. For many Americans, it is the first confirmation that a coordinated national mafia network exists. Stefano Magaddino is linked to the meeting, reinforcing Buffalo's standing within that national structure. But the event also marks a turning point. Increased surveillance, federal investigations, and public awareness begin reshaping how organized crime operates. Unlike more publicized figures, Magaddino remains disciplined. There are no dramatic public reactions, no sudden shifts in leadership style, just a return to what Buffalo had always done best, staying quiet. Yet after Apalachin, silence alone would no longer guarantee protection.
In the years following Apalachin, organized crime across the United States entered a new era. Federal agencies expanded their focus, surveillance improved, informants began reshaping investigations. The invisible networks that once thrived in the shadows were now being studied, tracked, and documented. Buffalo felt the shift. Operations continued, but caution increased. Communication tightened. Leadership emphasized discipline more than ever. Magaddino's long rule depended on maintaining order inside the organization while adapting to outside pressure. At the same time, the country itself was changing. Economic patterns shifted. Younger generations approached crime and business differently. The structures built during Prohibition and the early Mafia years no longer fit as easily into the modern world. Buffalo still held influence, but the environment around it was no longer stable. For the first time in decades, the quiet empire faced uncertainty. not from rival gangs, but from time, law, and change.
By the early 1960s, Stefano Magaddino had ruled for decades longer than most mafia bosses ever managed. His longevity wasn't built on fear alone. It was built on routine, predictability, and a refusal to chase expansion that invited attention. But time was beginning to work against him. Law enforcement pressure increased steadily. Wiretaps, surveillance teams, and federal task forces began mapping relationships that had once existed only through whispers. Even Buffalo's reputation for secrecy could not fully shield it from this new reality. At the same time, Magadino himself was aging. Leadership required more delegation, more trust placed in others. That shift carried risk. Generational differences emerged, and younger associates viewed opportunity differently than those who had grown up under Prohibition-era discipline. Buffalo's organization still functioned, but it was no longer invisible. The empire remained intact, yet its foundation was slowly eroding.
Unlike other mafia families that collapsed in public violence, Buffalo's internal challenges rarely reached the streets. Disagreements surfaced quietly over leadership roles, business priorities, and how aggressively to respond to law enforcement pressure. Magadino's authority kept these tensions contained. Discipline remained enforced, and public conflict was avoided at all costs. That restraint preserved the family's reputation for stability, even as confidence inside the organization weakened. Nationally, the mafia was facing exposure through congressional hearings and increased media scrutiny. The myth of invisibility was gone. Buffalo adapted by shrinking its footprint rather than expanding it. There were no dramatic betrayals, no headlines announcing a collapse. Instead, influence narrowed. Operations became more localized. The organization survived, but survival no longer meant growth. It meant endurance.
By the late 1960s, Stefano Magaddino's era was drawing to a close. Health issues and legal pressure limited his ability to maintain direct control. The man who had defined Buffalo's mafia identity for nearly half a century was stepping back from daily operations. Without his steady hand, the organization faced a challenge it had rarely encountered: transition. Leadership shifts were handled carefully, but none carried Magaddino's authority or long-term vision. The structure remained, but the center of gravity had moved. National crime networks were fragmenting under pressure from new laws and investigative techniques. The old system of respect-based leadership no longer guaranteed protection. Buffalo didn't collapse, it receded. What followed was not chaos, but a quieter, less certain continuation of a once dominant system.
Through the 1970s, the Buffalo crime family continued operating, but on a reduced scale. Gambling, small-scale rackets, and legacy business interests persisted, carefully managed to avoid attracting attention. The organization had adapted to a new priority: staying out of the spotlight entirely. Federal prosecutions nationwide reshaped organized crime. Informants became more common, surveillance more precise. For Buffalo, survival depended on avoiding the mistakes that had destroyed louder, more aggressive families elsewhere. This era lacked defining moments. No dramatic trials, no public wars, just a gradual narrowing of influence. To outsiders, Buffalo's mafia seemed almost gone, but internally, it still existed, quieter than ever, holding on to remnants of a system built decades earlier. The disappearance wasn't sudden. It was deliberate.
Stefano Magaddino's death in 1974 marked the end of the Buffalo crime family's longest and most defining chapter. For nearly half a century, his leadership had provided consistency. Without him, the organization faced a reality it had long delayed: succession without a unifying figure. Leadership roles shifted carefully. No dramatic announcements, no public struggles.
The transition reflected the same discipline that had kept the family stable for decades. Yet, internally, the difference was clear. Authority was now shared, negotiated, and occasionally questioned. Nationally, organized crime was entering a new era shaped by federal prosecutions and evolving investigative tools. Buffalo's leaders responded by narrowing operations, focusing on familiar territory rather than expansion. The goal wasn't power anymore. It was continuity. And for a time, continuity held.
By the 1980s, the forces reshaping organized crime were impossible to ignore. Federal racketeering laws strengthened prosecutions. Surveillance technology improved. Informants, once rare, became central to investigations. Buffalo also faced economic changes. The city's industrial base declined, altering labor structures that had once supported organized networks. Old revenue streams weakened. New ones carried greater risks. Unlike earlier decades, adaptation came slowly. Leadership remained cautious, avoiding expansion into unfamiliar territories. The family's influence narrowed to what could be managed quietly and reliably. Across the country, several crime organizations fractured under legal pressure. Buffalo did not fracture. It contracted. The difference mattered. It preserved stability, but also signaled a steady loss of reach. As the late 1980s moved into the 1990s, organized crime in America adapted through quieter partnerships. Networks formed around opportunity rather than territory, and relationships shifted depending on business needs. Buffalo followed this pattern cautiously. Connections developed with individuals and groups beyond the city, but always without the visibility that had exposed other organizations. The strategy remained consistent: avoid conflict, avoid attention, maintain continuity. Observers often compared Buffalo's approach to similarly discrete groups in cities like Detroit, organizations that prioritized patience and long-term survival over public dominance. New business relationships emerged during this period, shaped by changing markets and generational turnover. Yet even as these adjustments occurred, the scale remained smaller than in earlier decades. Buffalo wasn't expanding. It was adapting. Carefully.
By the 1990s, public understanding of organized crime had shifted dramatically. Books, documentaries, and media coverage brought renewed attention, but not always accuracy. Misidentified photographs, mistaken identities, and exaggerated claims blurred the line between history and myth. For Buffalo, a family built on secrecy, this created a strange legacy. Viewers and researchers questioned details, corrected timelines, and challenged narratives. Some pointed out when images showed members of other families. Others debated connections, leadership roles, and historical movements across cities. These discussions revealed something important. Buffalo's story had rarely been documented in the open. Much of what existed came from fragmented records, testimony, and recollection. The truth lay somewhere between silence and speculation. And as the century closed, the organization itself continued to fade, leaving behind questions that history would still struggle to answer.
By the early 2000s, organized crime in America looked very different from the world Stefano Magaddino once controlled. Large, centralized hierarchies had weakened under decades of prosecutions, surveillance, and economic change. Buffalo was no exception. What remained of the organization functioned on a smaller, more localized scale. Familiar relationships and legacy connections continued, but the structure lacked the authority and reach it once held. Law enforcement attention remained steady, ensuring that any attempt at expansion carried immediate risk. For many residents, the presence of a crime family had become more historical than visible. Stories lingered, names carried weight, but daily life in the city no longer revolved around underworld influence. Buffalo's Mafia had not vanished overnight. It had slowly receded into the background of a changing century.
As the decade continued, investigators and historians noted a pattern familiar across former mafia strongholds: legacy businesses outlasting the organizations that once shaped them. Restaurants, construction ties, social clubs, and local partnerships remained part of community life, even as direct criminal coordination became harder to prove. Buffalo reflected this transition. Influence no longer came from centralized leadership, but from residual relationships built over generations. The system had decentralized. At times, observers debated whether the families still existed in any traditional sense. Some pointed to remaining connections. Others argued the structure had effectively dissolved. Both views captured part of the truth. The organization's identity was no longer defined by power. It was defined by memory.
Federal and state investigations did not stop with the decline of traditional mafia families. Instead, they shifted focus toward long-term monitoring, financial tracking, and preventing resurgence. The strategy was preventative rather than reactive. Buffalo's remaining networks operated under this constant awareness. Any structured attempt to rebuild carried risks that earlier generations had never faced. Technology allowed investigators to connect patterns once hidden for decades. This pressure ensured that organized crime in the city could not easily return to its former scale. The environment had changed permanently. For the Buffalo crime family, survival had once depended on silence. Now, silence existed on both sides, organization and investigation, each waiting, watching, and adapting.
Historians often compare Buffalo's trajectory with other discrete crime organizations in the United States. Detroit is frequently mentioned, another group known for patience, cross-border proximity, and minimal public exposure. These comparisons highlight a shared strategy: survive by avoiding unnecessary attention. Both cities demonstrated how geography and discipline could sustain influence for decades. Yet Buffalo's path remained unique. Its rise was tied closely to Prohibition and border trade. Its longevity was shaped by Magadino's leadership, and its decline followed a slower, quieter arc than most. The lesson wasn't about dominance. It was about endurance. And endurance in organized crime rarely attracts headlines until it disappears.
By the 2010s, the Buffalo crime family had largely slipped from public conversation. New criminal enterprises operated differently, decentralized, digital, and often disconnected from traditional mafia structures. What remained in Buffalo was mostly historical footprint. Occasional investigations surfaced, but none suggested a return to the scale of earlier decades. The era of long-standing, hierarchical families had given way to a fragmented landscape. For many, the organization existed primarily in archives and recollections. Its most powerful years were now several generations removed. There was no dramatic ending, no final confrontation, just a slow transition from present influence to historical case study. The story of the Buffalo crime family challenges common perceptions of organized crime. It wasn't defined by constant violence or sudden collapse. Instead, it demonstrated how discipline, geography, and patience could sustain an underground system for decades. From early immigrant networks to Prohibition-era smuggling, from national mafia coordination to quiet decline, the organization adapted to each era it encountered. Its survival depended on remaining unnoticed, and its disappearance followed the same pattern. Buffalo's history reveals that organized crime doesn't always end in dramatic fashion. Sometimes it dissolves slowly, losing relevance as the world changes around it. What remains are lessons about power, secrecy, and time, and a reminder that influence, once established, can echo long after it fades.
More than a century after its earliest roots, the Buffalo crime family stands as one of the longest-lasting and most secretive mafia organizations in American history. It rose quietly, expanded carefully, and declined without spectacle. Stefano Magaddino's leadership shaped its identity, disciplined, patient, and resistant to attention. Geography gave it opportunity. Time gave it endurance. Change ultimately reduced its reach. Unlike the dramatic stories told about larger cities, Buffalo's legacy is defined by what wasn't seen: the absence of public wars, the avoidance of headlines, and the steady rhythm of operations that blended into everyday life. Today, the organization exists mostly in records, testimonies, and memory. Its influence shaped a city and connected to a national network, but its ending came not with collapse, only with disappearance. A quiet empire, one that lasted by staying in the shadows and left history the moment the shadows changed.